The last Nvidia graphics card to bear the name Titan was released in 2018. After 7 models of GPU designed to break barriers in both performance and price, the swan song of the Titan brand was this: the $2,500 24GB Titan RTX. As usual, the top of the Turing stack threw out such unambitious concepts as value and common sense, and instead embraced the new normals of hardware ray tracing and deep learning super sampling. At this point in the Remembering the Titan series, we're getting close to the present day. My normal test rig uses a Ryzen 5 7500F, which is a solid enough chip for benchmarking older GPUs, but for those occasions where I need a little more CPU horsepower, I decided I needed an upgrade. I'd like to thank Crucial for helping make my new Ryzen 7 7800X3D test rig possible. They not only supplied 32GB of their DDR5 Pro overclocking RAM, but also the 4TB P3 Plus NVMe SSD needed to store all these AAA games from 2018 through to the present day, as well as a second one which is going into my capture PC. Check out Crucial's range of performance DDR4 and DDR5, as well as their solid state drives at the link below. Titan was always synonymous with giving the best possible performance at any price, but the birth of the RTX brand saw Nvidia create a whole new metric to judge performance by. The company had already proven comfortable segmenting their product lineup, with GT models for those who didn't need much more than a place to plug in their monitor, GTX for the hoi polloi, and GTX Titan for the 1% of the 1%. RTX was a layer above GTX, offering something new and exciting that hadn't been available before, and, crucially, which their red competitors didn't have an answer for. RTX encapsulated 2 main features: hardware ray tracing and deep learning super sampling. The concept of DLSS was that games could run at below native resolutions while looking as good as or better than native. Put simply, you got the frame rates of lower resolutions while still looking like higher resolutions. Whether you look at its original proposition, whereby the GPU's tensor cores would have to be trained on a per-game basis, or the revised version that's a more universal temporal upscaler using the tensor cores for calculating motion vectors, the sales pitch for DLSS kinda implied that your shiny new Turing GPU might not be good enough to get a decent frame rate on its own. Despite some fears centered on Nvidia's typically misleading marketing slides, Turing did actually offer a substantial performance increase over Pascal, its predecessor, so DLSS on its own didn't make much sense. That is, until you factor in ray tracing. RT was the headline feature of the Turing series, offering a form of rendering that was previously impossible on consumer-grade hardware. And ray tracing was demanding. The earliest games to feature RT only had limited feature sets, using the technology to render shadows or reflections or GI, but rarely more than one at a time, and still the act of turning RTX on would rob you of more than half your frame rate. The most spectacular demonstrations of RTX in the early days came in the form of mods for older games, which took that simpler, blockier art style and gave it super realistic lighting, shadows and reflections. It was absolutely transformative, and all it cost was about 97% of your frame rates. RTX was obviously controversial. It felt like a scam, especially when applied to anything below the top tier of GPUs in the series, as turning RT-enabled games up to the high resolutions and quality settings that gamers had come to expect was virtually impossible without also using DLSS, and, especially in the early days, Nvidia's upscaler did not live up to the hype. Given these well-founded concerns around the new RTX brand then, the Titan bearing that name would have some pretty hefty expectations to fill. After all, if there's an exciting new rendering technique that brings the rest of the series to their knees, Surely the $2,500 flagship would show those games in their best light? One of the more puzzling choices for an RT launch title was Battlefield 5. After all, while Battlefield games at the time had a campaign mode, they were most known for their competitive multiplayer, and if ever there were a group of people unwilling to give up performance for a graphical boost, it's sweaty FPS players. Battlefield 5 featured ray-traced reflections, which were demonstrated heavily in the initial RTX marketing materials, but didn't really offer anything by way of a competitive advantage in this context. Worst of all, RTX required running the game in DX12, which in this case was a stuttering nightmare compared to DX11, so even if there was a minimal cost to performance associated with RT, it would still have been the worst way of playing the game. Benchmarking in multiplayer games can be inconsistent, so instead I went through the first section of the Provence chapter of the campaign with RT cranked to its maximum, only to find the stutter was absolutely intolerable. Thankfully I've had the problem before and found a solution, which is disabling Control Flow Guard. If I remember, I'll put a link to Obnot's video about how to do it in the description. This fixes the stutter, meaning all we're left with is the game's RT performance, which is better than I'd feared. I think there's been some optimization since the game launched, as I saw pretty decent frame rates at 1080p and 1440p, and 4K wasn't as terrible as I'd feared. Still, this is in the region of half what you'd expect without ray tracing, so it's still not a good idea. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was perhaps a better fit for the new rendering technology than Battlefield, even if it was still limited to just one aspect of the image. As the name suggests, Shadow of the Tomb Raider featured ray-traced shadows, which can be an underrated aspect of RT, especially if you haven't seen a lot of distractingly low-resolution shadow maps, or shadows which suddenly jump in quality as you get closer to them. RT shadows not only look more realistic, getting darker and more defined the closer they are to the subject, and blurrier and more diffuse further away, but they also don't get as pixelated. Normally, though it must be said a lot of the earlier solutions like this one are clearly being cast by a simplified, low-res version of the models, and this sometimes becomes obvious around hair. From a performance perspective, the numbers at 1080p and 1440p are close to those seen in Battlefield 5. However, in the context of a third-person single-player game, these are far more respectable. 2018's addition to the then rather bloated Assassin's Creed series was built on the same engine as its predecessor, and so AC Odyssey wasn't quite ready for the ray tracing revolution. As a conventionally rendered game, it was still very demanding on hardware, in fact even more so than some of the RT games I've featured so far, using the built-in benchmark at the highest quality settings, which, why wouldn't you? This is a Titan after all. At these settings, 1080p falls below 100 FPS, and while 1440p is above the 60 mark for the most part, 4K doesn't quite manage to hit 50. There's an argument to be made that PC gamers have overly high expectations, thus devs include these ultra high quality settings for future hardware in the spirit of games like Crysis. There may be an element of truth to that, but try explaining it to someone who just spent $2,500 on a graphics card. Launched in 2019, Remedy's Control was one of the first games to bring an RT experience with more than one aspect of the technology. Built using their in-house Northlight engine, Control featured RT reflections and shadows as well as indirect lighting. This all helped make Control one of the more compelling uses of RT for a while, though through a modern lens it's hard to ignore some of the graininess caused by relatively low ray counts that the engine can't completely remove. It's crying out for ray reconstruction, which is a technology the Titan actually supports, and which would take the image quality up to another level. I have my fingers crossed that Remedy will patch it in the future. Meanwhile, without DLSS, performance falls off steeply with each increase in resolution. 1440p is already below 60 FPS, and 4K drops even below 30. So even in this title from just a year after the Titan's release, owners would expect to have to reduce settings or turn to DLSS to get a playable experience at these higher resolutions. Red Dead Redemption 2 is another game which failed to embrace RT, and yet is still a tough one to get to maximum settings even 6 years later. And no, not just because of the awkward menu. Rockstar's more recent games, if we can call GTA 5 recent, have been visually gorgeous while still managing to scale down to lower end hardware, but also having ultra settings that can absolutely wreck high-end systems for years to come. This open world title can manage a 60 plus average in the final stage of the built-in benchmark at both 1080p and 1440p, but at 4K it still can't hit the 60 mark. Perhaps the decision not to add ray tracing was for the best. It seems a bit unfair to call Quake 2 a 2019 title, given its original date was back while I was still in high school. In those days, I couldn't afford a good enough 3D accelerator to run this game at all, and 22 years later I owned an RTX 2070, so I guess I still didn't have a good enough PC to run Quake 2. To be fair, with some DLSS upscaling, this fully path-traced version of the venerable FPS could run on lower-end RTX cards, but to get the full, unfettered experience, you needed more. In fact, you needed more than even the Titan could provide. Things start off well enough with an average of almost 100 FPS at 1080p, but 1440p starts to feel sluggish. This is an easy 1000 FPS without RT, and a mere 50 FPS with it. At 4K, you're getting the true 90s PC gaming experience. Back then, graphics technology moved fast, and buying the wrong GPU could give you a terrible gaming experience with single-digit FPS. The Titan is at least in double digits, but not by much. CDPR's long-awaited Cyberpunk 2077 began life on PC as a colossal disappointment, especially to the plebs who couldn't afford a high-end GPU. The dystopian future setting of Night City could look spectacular with ray tracing enabled, but very few GPUs of the era could actually take advantage of it. 4 years on, the game has aged rather gracefully, although system requirements have climbed even higher. Path tracing was already demanding in Quake 2, and Johnny Silverhand has more polygons than the entirety of id's game put together. Without RT, the game's already crying out for DLSS. 1080p is fine at 100 FPS, and 1440p averages a très bon 69, but 4K is barely over 30 FPS. With RT Ultra, which, while covering most of the RT bases in terms of lighting, shadows and reflections, isn't true path tracing yet, the Titan has lost more than half its performance compared to running with RT disabled. When it finally comes to path tracing, these numbers are essentially meaningless. Nothing here is remotely playable. Enabling DLSS could be seen as a workaround, but it needs to be used at its most aggressive level to get even remotely decent performance, and by that point, I'd question whether path tracing is even worth it. Forza Horizon games always make a pleasant juxtaposition to Cyberpunk. They're still open world games with cars in them, but generally are much easier to run. Horizon 5 is notoriously lightweight, though it's also known for something of a bias towards newer architectures. Still, this is a Titan, and there's no question that this can run the upstart game at 1440p, even at extreme with ray-traced reflections enabled. 4K, however, is a little disappointing. None of the settings tested hit 60 even with RT turned off, so owners of 4K displays would want to add a little DLSS. Thankfully, the quality still holds up. Metro Exodus released in 2019 and featured a decent amount of ray tracing options. However, 4A games seem to have been quite taken with the technology, so the 2021 Enhanced Edition featured a full RT global illumination system that can completely replace standard rasterized rendering, and requires an RT graphics card to run. Arguably, this means Metro Exodus beat Indiana Jones to the punch, though there's still an otherwise identical version of Metro available for people who don't have an RT-enabled GPU yet. I had a similar issue in the Metro benchmark as I saw in Battlefield 5. Unbelievable amounts of stutter that, if this were gameplay, would have been utterly intolerable. I've never seen it happen to this extent before, and I think it might be an issue peculiar to owners of X3D chips. After a bit of searching, I found the solution: disable Game Bar. Now things are running just fine, or, well, as fine as one might expect. The RTX Titan can only deliver about 60 FPS at 1080p Ultra, with 1440p hitting the mid-40s, and 4K looking disappointingly cinematic. By 2022, PS5 ports had started appearing on PC to varying degrees of success. One of the better examples was the Nixie's port of Insomniac's Spider-Man, which could be quite easy going on GPUs, but did have the option of enabling RT reflections. Naturally, being set in Manhattan, there are plenty of occasions to show off the tech, though it's not quite as comprehensive as the solution found in the Miles Morales standalone expansion, or in the sequel which arrives on PC soon. Again, while 1080p and 1440 are both fine performers, 4K is a step too far for this one, and needs at least quality DLSS for a decent experience. The VRAM panic of 2023 was arguably triggered by another PlayStation port. The Last of Us Part 1 demands at least 8GB of video memory, even at 1080p, though thankfully that's an area where the Titan RTX still shines. That being said, the Titan still gets put through the ringer by this PS5 remake. At 1080p it's only managing 76 FPS, which is just 4 frames ahead of the GPU used in Sony's base model console. At 1440p, the Titan can still play without having to drop settings, thanks to the 24GB frame buffer, but it can only deliver 55 FPS. And at 4K, it drops a little below 30. The Titan doesn't even get to show off its party trick, as the developers chose not to implement any kind of ray tracing. Obviously, they needed to leave something for the inevitable next-gen remaster. Only a year after the PC release of Spider-Man, Insomniac's Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart got ported to PC, along with a full suite of RT effects. The console original only featured some minimal reflections, but on PC we have access to shadows and ambient occlusion too. The impact of these effects is reasonably minimal compared to some games, only cutting performance by about 20% even when cranked up to maximum. However, it was already demanding as hell before even turning on the ray tracing. The Titan is perhaps one of only 2 first-gen RT cards that's really suited to this game too, as 8GB of VRAM quickly proves to be insufficient in this game. That doesn't mean the Titan performs well. Even without RT, it's barely playable at 4K and relies heavily on DLSS with RT turned on. Upscaling has always been a problematic feature in this game, and while DLSS is the superior method, at ultra performance there are still a ton of artifacts that just make the game hard to enjoy. At the end of a generally very annoying year for gamers, Alan Wake 2 was the last straw for many. Nvidia GPUs just one generation older than the Titan RTX, including the Titan V and GTX 1080 Ti, were initially considered unsuitable for playing this game. The DX12 Ultimate requirement meant those graphics cards were unplayable, often slower than budget cards from just a year later. While this was amended in a patch soon after launch, AMD owners fared even worse. Radeons based on GCN architectures, including Vega, had horrendous visual glitches that looked like some kind of creepypasta nightmare fuel. Anyway, the Titan RTX didn't have to worry about such game-breaking issues. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Without RT, the game looked incredible, but still runs at fairly pedestrian frame rates, with 4K only just scraping 30 FPS. Meanwhile, the game's RT implementation uses path tracing, and like in Cyberpunk, this technique proves to be too much for the first-gen RTX card. Turning on the maximum amount of DLSS can mostly mitigate the performance loss, but again, the resulting softness might make you rethink how important this whole path tracing thing is after all. "2024 was a breakthrough year for ray tracing. The promise of RT exclusive games was finally being realised in the mainstream, thanks to engines like Snowdrop, id Tech and Unreal Engine 5. Black Myth Wukong uses UE5's Lumen system for global illumination, while still falling back on traditional rasterized rendering for shadows and reflections. Although it's not a very Titan way of thinking, I've finally bowed to pressure and dropped below the maximum quality preset. I've tested at the high preset without using upscaling, despite the fact that the game really does seem to want you to. It also defaults to using frame generation, which is a technology designed to turn high frame rates into even higher ones, and isn't really intended to help out hardware that couldn't otherwise hit 60 FPS, so I've turned it off. It doesn't work with DLSS on this card anyway. At 1080p the game doesn't really need any help, as it can just about hit 60 all by itself, though at higher resolutions a little upscaling may be in order. There's also a full RT mode, which is essentially path tracing, which we've already seen that first gen RTX can't handle too well. Path tracing solves BMW's issues with shadow cascades, as well as giving more accurate reflections. But once again, it comes at the expense of performance. Native 1080p is only running at 16 FPS, and higher resolutions than that are in the single-digit range, so upscaling is practically mandatory. At 25% of native resolution, the lowest setting possible, the game recoups almost all the performance lost in enabling path tracing, but sacrifices a hell of a lot of image quality in the process. Despite the graphical splendour of the Alan Wakes and Wukongs of the world, there were still games released on PC in 2024 which don't support ray tracing. The latest generation consoles have RT hardware included almost as an afterthought, so many of the games designed with the base PS5 in mind have little to no RT at all. God of War Ragnarok is the latest title in this category, although the recent PS5 Pro update has apparently introduced RT reflections to help justify that console's existence, and they haven't made their way to the PC version yet. Does that mean the Titan RTX can fly through it with no issues? No. Actually, in fairness, 1080p and 1440p can happily run maxed out, though with some dips below 60 at 1440p. 4K, meanwhile, is only really good for a 30 FPS lock, which might be acceptable to some, but which would be improved with some balanced DLSS. Star Wars Outlaws might not be that popular as games go, but it's made in the Snowdrop engine used by Ubisoft, and will likely be used by whoever acquires their IP when they eventually sell up. Like UE5, Snowdrop has fully integrated ray tracing in both global illumination, which doesn't require special RT hardware, and direct illumination, which does. Outlaws can be a pretty painful experience on cards with less VRAM, but the Titan proves to do pretty well, and while 1440p falls short of 60 FPS, it's close enough that it could be fixed with a little DLSS. 4K might even make for a passable 30 FPS without needing upscaling. However, DI is much more demanding. I tested every quality level of RTX DI and found that without enabling DLSS, the Titan can produce pretty reasonable frame rates at 1080p all the way up to high, but 1440p gets rough above low, and at 4K nothing can hit even 30 FPS without upscaling. Most games with mandatory ray tracing so far haven't had a specific hardware requirement. Machine Games decided to skip the pretense altogether, and so Indiana Jones and the Great Circle became the first game without a fallback for owners of legacy hardware. As upset as that made people, if you have even a first generation RTX GPU, it's really not that bad. And the Titan can handle 1080p and 1440p supreme quality really quite well. Even 4K is acceptable, at least in the context of the rest of the AAA games released in 2024, and a small amount of DLSS wouldn't hurt either. However, like with Wukong, the shadow draw distance can be closer than you'd like, even with the settings cranked, and the intended solution to that is, alas, the dreaded path tracing. Once again, this is outside of the Titan's wheelhouse, and even 1080p needs at least balanced DLSS to even be called cinematic. 1080p and 1440p can be made reasonably playable with an eye-watering amount of upscaling, but 4K is pretty much out of the question. It's a perilous world being an early adopter. On the one hand, the cutting edge is always alluring. Who doesn't want to try out the latest innovative technology as soon as they hear about it? On the other hand, first generation technology has a tendency of aging poorly, and RTX improved dramatically in just one generation. The RTX 3080 Ti could run Cyberpunk's RT Overdrive mode about 3 times faster than the 2080 Ti, with the average performance gain across multiple games still being close to double what was possible with first-gen technology. I don't have a lot of personal experience with the RTX 40 series, but I do know that the RTX 4070 is comparable to the 3080 in terms of RT performance, and the upcoming 50 series will no doubt be even better. Seeing the Titan RTX being bested by GPUs a quarter of its price after just a few years is all part of the early adopter experience, I suppose, but it's gotta sting. I can't help but feel a little bit sorry for people who bought the Titan RTX. After all, it was the second most expensive single GPU GeForce card ever made up until that point, and you'd have to be extremely patient and forgiving to simply accept that your shiny new $2,500 graphics card couldn't run some games maxed out at 4K in the year it released. And I'm not even talking about ray tracing here, I mean Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Yes, you and I might be sensible shoppers with realistic expectations who check reviews before we buy and are prepared to make compromises to quality for the sake of performance, but we're not the target audience for a Titan, and we never have been. Titans are for those who'll pay top dollar to get the best, and who haven't yet realised that the best tech will never be good enough, that you can't fill the hole in your soul with expensive things, that the house always wins, that you'll be chasing pixels and frames for the rest of your life, and the only one who wins is Jensen's accountant. Anyway, it's not all doom and gloom. Strangely enough, the Titan RTX has actually retained a pretty sizable portion of its resale value in 2025. Part of that's branding. Some people will still pay for rare and exotic tech to add to a collection, and if I had the money and space, I'd probably do exactly that. However, the Titan RTX has something that most of the far better value and better performing GPUs that followed it don't have. A great big bushy 24GB frame buffer. That hasn't come into play very often in my benchmarks, with only a handful of games truly benefiting from having more than the 11GB of the 2080 Ti or 12GB of the 3080 Ti and 4070, and even in those instances it's never been the difference between a game being playable and unplayable, simply different degrees of unplayable. However, outside of the gaming world, there's a particularly vibrant area of growth that will take every last kilobyte of VRAM it can get. Generative AI. It's largely because of the AI bubble, AI boom, that the Titan RTX is still highly sought after on the used market, and the demand is climbing. I spent £550 for my card last year, and while I'd love to keep hold of it for future testing, or simply as a nice thing to own, I can make a tidy profit selling it onto an AI bro right now, and that money could go towards my next big project idea. Granted, that would mean I'm directly contributing to the massive environmental footprint of the AI ecosystem, the slow dissolution of whole industries, and the concept of copyright itself that AI threatens to bring. But, hey, I'm not exactly saving the world by keeping one GPU on a shelf, am I? If you've gotten this far through the video, having bought a Titan RTX back in 2018, sorry, I don't mean to be insulting. With 6 years of hindsight, I'd have recommended buying stock in Nvidia rather than buying Nvidia's stock, if that makes sense, and even at the time I'd probably have suggested you split the difference and get a 2080 Ti instead. $1,200 invested in Nvidia in 2018 would be worth over $25,000 today, which could buy you a whole lot of RTX 5090s. Still, look on the bright side. You can sell your Titan today and get enough money to buy a new RTX 5070, which I hear is as powerful as a 4090. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.